Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again, and welcome to those joining for the first time. My name is Sarah Longcar, and I'm ACSI's Learning and Development Manager. We're providing this legal legislative brief with our team here at ACSI. We'll begin by providing you with a report on the latest changes that have come through since our time together last Monday. Then we'll spend the final portion of our time together in Q&A with questions we've received from school leaders and perhaps a few that are being submitted now in the Q&A panel. Before we get started today and I hand things over to George, we would love to hear a little bit more about who's joining our time together today by using the poll. And so we encourage you to take a moment and fill out the poll appearing on your screen at this time as I turn things over to George. Thank you, George.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everybody from sunny Washington, D.C. We have a few things to update you on this afternoon, and hopefully we can be a blessing to you. Let me begin with our usual disclaimer. Our presentation today is designed to be educational, accurate, and authoritative. But it's not legal advice, so if you do need legal advice, you should seek that from a legal professional or other. So thank you for that, and we'll move on to the next one. We have for you all just a reminder that the Legal Legislative Department has a web page on the ACSI website, and would invite you to take a look at that. We've got all kinds of great information there. It's being constantly updated, and so I would just call that to your attention. So that you make the most of that. So if we could move on to the first slide. My opportunity to speak to you this afternoon is to give you first a quick legislative update, some of the new things that have happened, and then I'm also going to summarize some of the equitable services comments that I've made, and there's some breaking news on that front, which we'll get into in just a moment. Let's start with the legislative update and outlook. You heard a lot last week about how Congress was needing to replenish the Paycheck Protection Program, how that had been delayed, and I'm happy to say that that did finally happen. The new replenishment law is called the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. That way we can have a really long acronym. The president signed it into law on Friday, came through the Senate on Tuesday, the House on Thursday, president on Friday. What does it do? It adds $310 billion into the Paycheck Protection Program. It sets aside a portion of that for community banks and small lenders, $60 billion. It adds $60 billion to the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, $75 billion for hospitals and healthcare providers, and $25 billion for testing. So that's moving ahead. Next slide, please. Congress currently is meeting in pro forma sessions until May the 4th. It's been doing that really for the last month, throughout this month of April, except when it needed to come together to vote, and then it did that as close to unanimously as it possibly could. Phase 4 funding bill is being negotiated. That's actually happening now. Nobody knows what will be in it, whether it be infrastructure money, money to the states. That you've probably seen some media about that. I did quote from last Friday's The Hill newspaper. Democrats have pushed for the need for more funding for state and local governments. The president tweeted that he envisioned the next package including fiscal relief for state and local governments, but also funding for infrastructure investments and a payroll tax cut. So we'll see what happens. They're going to hit the ground running when they do come back on May the 4th, and they are expected to come back actually to town. So right now, our focus at ACSI, our meetings on the Hill with the administration. I just ask you please to be praying for us. We're focused on broadening options for affordability for our parents and families. Wanting to make sure non-public schools are included in any kind of opportunities or benefits that are provided, so it's not limited to public schools. And also at the same time to protect us against becoming recipients of federal financial aid. That's what the FFA is there for. And so I would just ask again for your prayer. That phase 4 bill, the next bill, is expected to be the first order of business when Congress gets back. So we will see if that really does happen. So next, please. Let's talk about the CARES Act and the Education Stabilization Fund. put together a new kind of set for you all. Just to summarize it, I thought this would make it logical. Here's what's in the Education Stabilization Fund. 18001 is the discretionary fund. Number 2 is the governor's fund. 3 is elementary and secondary. 4 is 18004, higher ed. And section 18005, all that is how to allocate the funds. It's the method, not the amount. The breaking news that I want to bring up to you is that the Secretary of Education has just announced within the hour that she's opened up the discretionary fund and created a new approach for applications for that. So now I've had maybe 5 minutes to prepare for this. And so if you will bear with me, I'm going to have to go my own here. But basically, if you go to the Department of Education's Education Stabilization Fund website, and I've got the link for you in the slide deck, but if you go to that website, you will find that there are 2 new funds based under the discretionary fund from that 2% off the top. And what the Secretary is calling it is the Rethink K-12 Education Models Grant. And then there's a second grant called the Reimagining Workforce Preparation Grant. I'm happy to say the Rethink K-12 Education Models Grant includes a requirement for equitable services. So when your state applies for that money, they will have to apply for equitable services at the same time. So you may remember, and I'll talk about this on the next screen, but the discretionary fund is based on the states having the highest need having the highest impact for coronavirus. So the Secretary has created a coronavirus burden table. That's also linked on the website for the discretionary grant. And I would just encourage you to take a look at that coronavirus burden table. There are going to be states in there that you wouldn't expect to be among the highest. For example, the state of West Virginia is in the 81st percentile. When the state makes its grant application for the discretionary fund, it will get extra points if it's in the 81st percentile or higher. So you wouldn't think that West Virginia with a low coronavirus rate would qualify as highly impacted, but the formula that the Secretary has created includes other factors in addition to that, and that pops West Virginia up. So all that to say, even if you have a low number of coronavirus cases, you might want to check your state on that coronavirus burden table. So I hope that made some measure of sense, but that's pretty exciting. That literally just went up on the Department of Education website the last 45 minutes to an hour. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. So now I'll go back to the slides and some of my logical thoughts. And if you have questions about this, I'll be happy to answer as much as I can. So let's move to the next slide. We would. So here's where I got into a little bit more. I wanted you all to have a clear vision for how the funds are set out. And the reason is because you may have to, fight for the state to do it the right way. So 18001, the discretionary funds, you see number 1 is 0.5% for outlying areas. Number 2 is 0.5% for Bureau of Indian Education. Number 3 is 1% to states with the highest coronavirus burden. Fund that the Secretary has just announced. She has 2 programs in there, and one of the programs includes equitable services as the part of the process. So then section 18002, that's the governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, and that's divided into 3. 1, the governor can give grants to LEAs, local education agencies most significantly impacted. 2, grants to higher education most significantly impacted. Or paragraph 3, which is where we come in general, that is to provide support to any other institution of higher ed, LEA, or education-related entity within the state that the governor deems essential to carry out emergency educational services to students. I just want to, again, flag this for you, that you want to make sure your governor knows that you're an education-related entity that he should deem essential for this purpose. And also, this is the one section that explicitly mentions early education. So then 18003, that's the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, talking about 44% allocation of the funds into that to the states are based on the same proportion that each state received under Title I-A in the most recent fiscal year. Then when the SEA, the state education agency, gets that money and turns around to give it to the local education agency, it's looking at the LEA's Title I proportion in the most recent fiscal year. So I hope that made sense. But that's where that ends. Once it comes to the LEA handing out money to schools or services to our non-public schools, that should be based on the total number of students. And as you know, that's where there's been some conflict. We're waiting for guidance. So we'll move to the next slide. And this is where I summarize that. The governor's fund, that's actually divided up into 60% based on the total population of individuals aged 5 to 24. And then 40% of those funds are based on the number of children under Section 1124C of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That's where we're getting our title numbers, or title students, those numbers. So the governor's emergency fund per state is divided 60-40 in that way. The elementary and secondary school fund is the other one, and we've already talked about how that's based on the Title I allocation to the SEA, and then the title allocation for the LEA under that. And then just to underline this, 18005, that section is how this is going to happen. How, not the amount. The local education agency that gets money for Section 002, the governor's fund, or Section 18003, the elementary and secondary school fund, they shall provide equitable services in the same manner as provided under Section 1117 of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to students and teachers in non-public schools as determined in consultation with representatives of non-public schools. So the governor's fund and the ESEA and the elementary school fund, those funds will be provided to non-public schools by means of equitable services. The services will be provided. It's the same manner is the effort. So next slide. I will say that notices inviting applications have already gone out for the governor's fund. That's the GEARF acronym, and the elementary and secondary school fund. So the applications, the notice for applications have gone out. So governors and states are applying for both of those funds. Week, the Department of Ed had a call for stakeholders on the day that they did the posting of the asking for invitations, but guidance still had not come in. And as you know, the guidance is the key issue, simply because some of the states are saying, well, we're going to base our equitable services on the Title I-A population of the non-public schools. We just want to make sure that we avoid that eventuality. So next slide. I'm going to remind you, so what do we do now? Well, what do we do now? We had recommended in this memo to school leaders, be reaching out to your LEA and to your governor. We have provided you a sample letter for your LEA, so I'm not going to go over all of that material again, but those links are there for you so that you can review that if you need to. And basically the steps were that you were to come, we would encourage you to come up with a list of the things you need and then reach out to your LEA and to your governors, and then be sure you have a copy of the law and the guidance in hand when you have your consultation meetings, and that memo to school leaders includes the text of the law for your convenience. Next slide. These are the Department of Ed websites, and I'm putting this here so that you've got access to this again. And that right here is the Education Stabilization Fund webpage. And if you go there, you'll see the discretionary fund announcement today with some of the details. You'll want to reach out to your state, your governor, and your SEA. Want to be part of that if you've got good ideas for their grants. And so with that, I will pass it on to our next speaker, who is Tom.
Thank you, George. I just have a couple updates for you today, and then we'll move right on in just a second here. But I want to go back. Of course, the Phase 2 bill before the CARES Act was called the Families First Coronavirus Act. And I want to just remind you that that is taking place. It started on April 1st. So all employers were required at that point to begin to offer emergency sick leave and emergency family medical leave to its employees who needed it and had qualifying reasons. If you'll remember, there are 6 qualifying reasons to be able to take the emergency sick leave, and then 1 qualifying reason to be able to use the emergency family medical leave. So again, you want to be sure that you are applying that to your school and you're using that if your employees qualify. There are guidance that show that there are some huge penalties if you don't do it as a school. So you want to be sure that you're following that guidance. We did write guidance. It's still on our legal legislative resource page, so you can go there and read all the details. We covered it in the first couple webinars also that we did, one in March and then the first one in April. The Department of Labor continues to constantly add more guidance to their FAQs on a weekly basis. So it's important that you check that every week just to get clarifying questions. They've got way more on there than they started out. I think the first week they started, there was some 30 FAQs. Now they're up to 88 FAQs with questions and answers that probably would help you to understand it better if you look through some of those along with our guidance. And then I give you the website there that you can go to those FAQs to be sure that that you stay on top of those. But I would bookmark that, especially as somebody at your school that's handling HR and dealing with the emergency sick leave and the FMLA with your employees. They should be looking at that website to continue to get guidance there. Next, I really want to just mention, George, of course, talked about the additional money of $310 billion to the CARES Act and to the PPP loans. Again, it's critical if you already applied for the loan and you haven't received it yet, or you haven't heard back from your lender, you want to check with them immediately. As the interim final rule states explicitly that you can only apply for one PPP loan. So you're wondering, boy, I filled out that application, but I don't know if the bank has ever, I've ever gotten approved or whatever. And we've gotten several questions like that. You need to get a hold of the lender that you applied with, because you can't just go out and apply again. If you've already applied, you just need to check with your bank to see if they still have your application and whether or not it will be submitted to the SBA when those applications start, which was today. So you should be contacting your bank or your lender today to say, did my loan application get submitted to the SBA? And again, you want to push and push and push and ask that question to be sure, because I believe, again, this money will go just as quickly as the first 300 and some million did, or 300 billion. If you've not applied for the loan, you can still start, and you can start today. The application process for this 310 million that was released today will start today. So again, you can apply for that starting now. Also, I wanted to mention the George mentioned that the new legislation adds $60 billion to the economic injury disaster loan. That also, again, is available to our schools. It's a low interest fixed rate loan that can provide up to $2 million in assistance for a small business that can be used to pay immediate expenses during the emergency. Now, if you've applied for the PPP loan, it has to be something different that you use it for. You can't use it for payroll. It's for 500 employees or less. Eligible applicants can also apply and request a $10,000 immediate disbursement, and that amount doesn't need to be repaid regardless of the loan decision of your PPP loan. If approved, the $10,000 will be provided to you in 3 days. So again, you can apply for that, and that then becomes part of the forgiveness in your PPP loan. But the rest of whatever you borrow, this loan is a low interest fixed loan rate that you do have to pay back besides that $10,000. So those are just a couple updates that I had, and I'm going to turn it over to Philip. Philip's going to give us some states things that are really specific to our states and what's been happening there. So Philip, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, so the states, just want to hit on a couple things here, specifically as they relate to opening back up and what the rest of the school year is going to look like. So all 50 states have asked for Washington or the Department of Education in Washington to waive the federal testing requirements. But again, be careful that we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. Where I am heading with this is that 40% of the states have some kind of school choice program that requires a testing mandate. And if you're a state, let's say like Indiana, where the testing mandate is for the state test, the problem may have taken care of itself, maybe, maybe not. If you're in a state where the testing mandate is not a state test, but a norm reference test, at least in my mind, that leaves a bigger open question. So where I'm going with this is all 50 states have asked for federal testing waivers for public schools as it relates to federal dollars that are tied to average yearly progress for students. What you need to make sure is that if you are in one of these states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, the list goes on, you've got it there in front of you. If you're in one of these states and you're participating in one of these school choice programs, you need to check to make sure that the testing mandate for that program has also been waived. And that may not be necessarily in the Department of Education in your state. That could be in the Department of Taxation. A lot of these programs run through the Department of Taxation, not the Department of Education. So it's an open question, something you want to be working with your CAPE representatives, with any other private school associations that are in your state to make sure you know what the requirements are for you and your students. Additionally, some of the states are offering districts to give the state test if they want, again, to measure where student achievements, student assessments are at for their own knowledge, not for the federal funding aspect. Next. Along with that, we also want to talk about all 50 states and the District of Columbia have closure orders or recommendations for closure. So what does that mean for schools reopening, specifically our schools reopening? A couple things. First, you're going to have to go back and look and see the governor's order for closure. Does that include private schools specifically, or is that just referring to public schools? And there's a mix. Some of them, it's just public schools with the private schools following suit. In others, it's both public and private. It's pretty clear about that. You also want to make sure that if it is just the public schools, that you don't have some kind of local health department requirement that the private schools also close. To my knowledge, there's not been any of those, but they do have some of those authorities to do that. All right, so all 50 states have either given orders or have given recommendation of orders for closure. Now, those that let's look at the ones that have the recommendations. And those are Maine, South Dakota, Idaho, Tennessee, California. That's been left up to local control and local authority to make those final calls. Also, for those that gave mandatory closures that were time-stamped, you see that next line there, those are all ending within the next 2 weeks. So they either need to be expanded or something new needs to come from the governor's office. Wyoming, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Montana. Lastly is North Dakota. It just simply said we're closed until further notice, so they could lift that at any time. So what does that mean for us? We've actually been getting a lot of questions just in the last today and even a few yesterday on what about reopening and what does that look like for us? This is going to be our recommendation. If your public schools are closed, then we're going to suggest that the private schools stay closed as well. Now we're talking K-12 education, child care or EE is a different question. So we can go down that road, but that's not what we're referring to here. But if your public schools are closed, we're going to recommend that you stay closed the remainder of this year as well. If your public schools reopen, so if you're in that list of local authority or the orders to close get lifted within the next 2 weeks and they expire, and you start having public schools reopen, we then suggest a couple things. One, simply because the public schools reopen does not mean that you have to reopen. I would consider that an optional choice. Do we want to reopen for this school year or not? What's left of it? I'd also suggest if you're going to open, you have to have a plan of reopening. What does that look like? You can't just simply throw the doors back open. How are we going to bring students back in and reintegrate? Also, what is our safety protocol going to be? And I would further say, once you have that plan in place, if you plan on opening again this year, that you then also work with your local health department for their approval on this. And the reason for this is a couple-fold. Let me get to the last point and I'll circle back. Jumping ahead of myself here. The third thing, I'm going to suggest you need to put parents on notice that, hey, if you're going to send your kids back, there is the potential that they're going to catch COVID-19, same with your staff, and give them a waiver to sign a release of liability, and a good one that's been drafted well. We do have a sample for early ed programs on our website. You can certainly use that as a template to work with. Always suggest for waivers that you work with an attorney who knows your state specific law to work with as well. But why do I say, go back real quick, sorry about that, but why do I say you need to check on the plan and then the notice and waiver to families? That has to do with liability. If the private schools are not going to have, well, not if, the private schools are not going to have the same protection that a public school does. And so what you want to avoid is any kind of negligence. You know, someone gets sick, or heaven forbid, someone passes away. You don't want the lawsuit that the school was negligent in how it cleaned, or negligent in allowing unsafe conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And so you want to make sure that you're doing the right steps to make it as safe as possible, both for those in the school and for the continued operation of the school itself. Next. And part of that's going to come down to, again, what are the things we're going to look at if we're going to open back up? And one of the legal risks is going to be, what is the standard we're going to be held to? And there are a number of ways the standards can be set on the federal level. Right, CDC has already set some on their interim guidance on schools and early childhood providers on things like cleanliness. What do we do if we suspect someone has COVID-19, those type of things. Now those, I'm going to say at this point, are probably inadequate. They need to be updated and provide better guidance for an ongoing continuation of education. But that is one example. There are a number of calls from different corners asking the U.S. Department of Education to provide guidance on what does opening schools back up in this new reality of COVID-19 look like. That has not been done yet, but that may very well be something that we wind up seeing here in the near future. State and local authority, your health department, you want to make sure, again, that they're signing off on your plan to reopen, and what does that look like, and any guidance they're giving that you're following. The governor's office provides guidance on what things like social distancing or groups, you know, meeting no larger than a certain number, that you're meeting those type of things. If your public schools Department of Education puts out some kind of template or standard for the public schools, you want to make sure you're looking at and paying attention to it. Doesn't mean you have to follow it every jot and tittle, but you need to be aware of it and make sure that you're meeting some kind of similar standard. Another way that you can get your hands tied is if you promise something, right? So if you promise we're going to open back up and we're going to screen every student every day, whatever that means, whatever that looks like, if you've made that promise, you've now tied your hands. So make sure you're careful in what you tell families and what you're promising to families as to what's going to be done. The last two, again, a professional organization, you know, ACSI could set a standard. It has not, I'm not saying it will, but something along those lines. The American Medical Association could set a standard. You want to look, again, not that you have to follow those, but you want to look at those, see how much in line we are, where we deviate, why do we deviate, those type of things. Things to look at specifically right now, the president's 3-phase plan to bring business and open up the community again, right? Schools are in phase 2 of those 3 phases. So you want to make sure you're looking at those. If you're going to go out on a limb on your own and open school back up, do we fit in the 2nd phase? And if not, are we going out too much on a limb on our own to do that? Other federal guidance, there will be other federal guidance coming. CDC updating its guidance, or other departments updating its guidance. Interestingly enough, the state regional PACs are starting to form. So there's one on the West Coast that's forming, there's one on the East Coast that's forming. And these states, as you see, they've got listed there. On the West Coast, you can also add Colorado and Nevada. Those two joined today. But these groups are coming together to say, we will do everything in conjunction together as a pact of states. Seeing that we share a border, that we are going to be jointly impacted by whatever decision the other makes, we want to jointly come to consensus on how we're going to open up businesses, schools, and life as we know it in COVID-19. They're probably going to set some standards, something you want to be aware of. State departments of education are already starting to talk about this as well. There's a group, the Southern Regional Education Board. It's a group of 17 states, and their heads of their Department of Educations, they've already created a task force. It's going to be led by some folks out of the Virginia Department of Education, but they're going to start a task force. How do we do education in schools during COVID-19? They're going to start setting standards. You want to be aware of those. Next. So what does this mean, not just for this school year, as we finish up the 2019-2020 school year, but what does this mean for 2020-2021? And so what I would just encourage you is you're not alone. Education Week, you're probably all familiar with that publication, did a poll just within the last week or two of public school superintendents. And they asked that question, do you have a plan yet for COVID-19 in the 2021 school year? Only 7% said, yeah, we got a plan, right? 11% said, haven't even thought of it. So somewhere in that middle, that 80 some odd percent said, we're trying to work to create something. I think that's where we're probably all at right now. What are we going to do to try to create some kind of contingency plans and new normality for 2021 school year? Next. So as we look to the future, the 2021 school year, what does a new normal look like? I'm going to say it will be a new normal. We aren't going to see a return to things as we've known it until we have some kind of either vaccine or medications or some kind of immediate response testing that takes place for COVID-19 that we can modify our behaviors accordingly or go back to the way that things used to be. So I'm gonna suggest, if you haven't heard this yet, you need to start planning for what does return to school, not in the end of the summer break, right? August, September timeframe, but what does returning to school look like in January? So we're now talking 2021. Colorado, the governor has asked the school districts to create plans on what a school look like if we don't return until January. He's already put everyone on notice about that. California has started having those conversations. I think you'll find most major universities are now starting to have that conversation. The difference between the university and the K-12 is we aren't going to be able to have a full economy open back up until K-12 students can go back to school, right? So we have parents who are now obligated to stay home or find some kind of childcare situation where their students can be safe while left alone, or while left, not left alone, but left with the caregiver or at the school. You can do that at the higher ed level. But the conversation is already taking place. What does starting school back in 2021 look like, not in the fall of 2020? The other reason this is important is there's a very high potential that we could have a secondary outbreak, right? Where we go back to the shelter in place, we're going to quarantine at home type of things, and we shut down school next year again for a period of weeks or months. And so we need to be aware that this is a real potential, and how are we going to address it? And so here are just some things that I want to hit through real quick. You'll have the PowerPoint. You can look through those. We don't have time to hit all of them. But these are aspects either universities are starting to look at, school systems are starting to look at, and then our fellow educators overseas who are weeks to months ahead of us, and some of those are starting to return to school, things that they are looking at and asking. So we'll just go through these real quick. You know, what does a modified transportation routine look like for buses? We're gonna have to have fewer riders on a bus. What does lunchtime look like? Staggered schedules, meals in classrooms, those type of aspects. Staggered stop times and start times. Are we gonna have some students who will go from the morning till lunchtime and then they get released either back home or to another portion of the school? Then you have the second wave that comes in that start at lunchtime and go to the end of the day. You know, what are those type of things look like? Is part of this gonna be now a new hybrid, part at home education, part in the classroom education? What would it take if the state then comes back and says we have to have smaller class sizes? no more than say 15 in a classroom. How are we going to be able to do that? Or can we shift the modeling to a university where Monday, Wednesday, Friday, one set is here, Tuesday, Thursday, another set is here? You need to look at your access. We're known for being welcoming, particularly to our families. You're probably going to have to put a kibosh on some of that. Limited access to parents, volunteers, even outside vendors. And then what does health screenings look like? There's a lot of talk about that now. Are we going to require everyone to wear masks? Are we going to do a temperature check at the front door for every student every day? What are those things going to look like? Next. Other things, we're going to have to be more liberal with our policies around absences. And probably if we're going to send a family home or quarantine them from home from the school for say a 2-week period, they're going to have to be able to do the same level of work from home that they did at the classroom. And so our online distance learning platforms and opportunities for schools, if anything, are probably going to have to get more robust over this next year going into the next school year. This isn't going to be for a short period. We get through the school year, we can go back to life as normal. It's probably going to require even more of the same for next year, which is going to require us to elevate our offerings for distance learning. Athletics, what is that going to look like? Both from practice to playing other teams to those sitting in the stands watching those who are playing. We hit on this, but the PPE, the personal protective equipment, who's going to need it? Who's going to be required to use it? What is that going to look like in the school setting? More than likely, you're going to have to come up with some more robust cleaning schedules and probably even increase your spend on that. And whatever guidance gets created, no doubt that's going to include these aspects. Again, some other things, should we continue sort of this year-round education, provide some wraparounds for the summer so that we can help students continue to build on what they've learned or maybe they didn't obtain through this past year, tutoring efforts along those type of things. And then just basic social distancing. How do we do classroom transitions between periods? For an enrichment course, do we need to do that just online in the evenings? Instead of having 30 students in the art class, they're going to be doing it primarily from home on their own and reporting in. What do we do with recess? And then I think probably more critical than some of these others is the spiritual and emotional well-being of our teams and of our students and our families. So with that said, these are some of the things that are being looked at. I think when we wind up looking at this year, I think we probably need to come into the standpoint that a lot of this year has already been spent. And then for next year, these are the things that are being talked about now. No doubt this is a fluid list, it will change. But what are the things that we need to be thinking about now, building the teams now so that we have answers to these questions? And I'll hand it back to Sarah and Tom and George at this point for a Q&A.
Thank you, Philip. We do want to jump into some of the questions that we've received here. The first one, Philip, is in reference to what you were talking about, but it's talking about a tutoring program. So, not school in of itself, and there's another question in regards to summer camp. But we'll start with the tutoring one. It says, it would be very limited, no more than 3 students and 1 teacher with a total of 6 classes and 2 buildings. So able to respect, some of those social distancing there. And the state's beginning to reopen this week. So they're asking, who do we ask for permission to have this tutoring program? And they do add that the state's reopen plan doesn't address schools in particular.
Yeah, I think you can draw a distinction. This is not school as usual or normal. This is something different. This is a tutoring program. What you'd want to do is reach out. I would say step 1 is to reach out to your local health department to get some further guidance and to see what they're going to want in a plan. I will say this is probably going to look similar to the EE programs that they've been allowing to open back up, which in those they're requiring, depending on what your state level is, and some states have now moved up to 50 groups of no more than 50. But my guess is your state's still probably at no more than 10. And so no more than 10 in a classroom. It's the same 10 each time. You don't have people switching back and forth, rotating. And then also probably staggered pickup drop-off time. And then some feedback on how you're going to do cleanliness and distancing, social distancing aspects. But that would be the place to start. Start back with your local health department and kind of go from there. Tom, there's a question here. It says, our lenders have told us we're allowed to apply for the PPP loan in multiple locations. But we're hearing you say that's not the case. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the Department of Labor's interim, they call it interim final guidance, clearly says that employers may only apply at one loan vendor or one bank for that application. So to have more than one application in may create some issues. So we're just following what the guidance says, and it says one only.
Related to that, there's been a couple questions that talk about with the PPP, what can you use that money for? So bonuses, can it be used for that? If we do hazard pay, so I'm assuming, I'm inferring a little bit here, but if we're going to give people a little above and beyond for coming in during this time, does that count? And then also, what kind of taxes are included?
Yeah, that's good question, Philip. We've provided quite a bit of guidance on that in our resource page. But off the top of my head, basically it's the as far as you can, any payroll, as far as any vacation pay, sick pay, any benefits such as a hazard pay or other stipend you might give them, any of those kind of things can be included. There is some stipulations where you cannot include the federal taxes, but again, I can't remember exactly which piece of that is, but you can look at that guidance that we have on the resource site. If you're going to do a bonus, you could include that also. Anything that has to do with payroll, but I believe on the payroll taxes, there is a part there that you cannot claim, and then you cannot, if you get credit for the emergency paid sick leave or the emergency FMLA, you cannot claim that as a part of the payroll forgiveness part.
Question here for Tom. It says, if we received a PPP loan and it'll meet our needs, should we still apply for an EIDL?
Great. The EIDL, again, it must be used for certain, in other words, if you were, if there was some other, so let's say you were, I'm trying to think of another use. Maybe you've got a large mortgage and you could borrow money to help you supplement that mortgage. It just cannot be used for the same thing that PPP is being used for. So some other disaster that's happened because of COVID that's not related to the PPP, then you could borrow that money and use it. Now, again, that first $10,000, if you apply for that, that can be used and be forgiven through the PPP loan.
George, here's a question for you. It says, if we receive PPP funding, we cannot access funding from the educational grants. Is that correct?
Right. I saw that question. I was a little bit confused about what might be the reference. So PPP funding is one thing, but then the grants that I was talking about go to the states. So the Education Stabilization Fund, as part of the CARES Act, those are the different funds that I was laying out under the Education Stabilization Fund, and those go to the states or the governors. And so the way you would receive those is through equitable services. And that's how that process would work. So yes, you would participate in both potentially. If you felt you needed a PPP loan, you'd go to the SBA for that. But if your state is getting Education Stabilization Fund grants from the federal government, then you would go to your LEA or to the governor in order to have equitable services provided through those funds. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's why I went into all the, forgive me, all the details of what the different funds were and how much was in each one, just so that you'd be able to fight for your portion of the equitable services as best as possible.
There's a question here that talks about what guidance we give for the EE programs. And so I'll hit that one. The EE programs have in many states been considered as a necessary operations. And so they've been allowed to operate, or if you go back to your Department of Health and talk with them, they've been giving authority for programs to open up. In fact, I know even in some areas they've been giving emergency approval to K-12 programs to open programs that didn't have them in the past because they are needed for emergency personnel and doctors, et cetera, for their kids to be watched. So the guidance for an EE program would essentially be make sure that you're following your guidance, that's whatever the closure mandate or order that's been given by the governor, that you are in touch with your local health department. They're going to be your liaison and sort of giving you the requirements of what they're going to require of you, which a lot of that's going to go back to the CDC guidance. If you've not looked at the CDC interim guidance for K-12 and child care providers, look at that, make sure you're following that guidance. Also on our website, we suggest if you are going to open back up, that you put every parent on notice. We have a waiver that's available on the coronavirus legal legislative side of the website. Use that to put parents on notice that their child may contract COVID-19, and it helps to protect the school a little bit during these times. You're also going to want to look at things, again, sort of similar list to what I've already gone over, but curbside drop-off and pickup, that is, staggered release times, staggered start times. You're probably going to have smaller class sizes, so 9 students to a room plus a teacher, or 10 students to the room plus a teacher, and it's going to be the same room, the same teacher each time, those type of things. So that's how I would answer that one.
Philip, can I sneak back in? I pulled up my guidance to answer that question about what's included in the payroll. And again, as I mentioned, salaries and all other wages, any healthcare benefits. So anything that the employer pays on healthcare, which would include vision, dental, those things can be included in that. Also, any retirement benefits. So if you do any kind of matching of a 401k or 403b, those amounts that the employer puts into that account can also be used as a part of the forgiveness. Any employer paid state or local payroll taxes. So if you pay state income taxes and those kind of things, that can be included. And then also what cannot be included though is any compensation of a person over $100,000. So you'd have to cap the forgiveness amount at $100,000. However, you can still add all the benefits, but you cannot add any of their salary over $100,000. And then you cannot include any federal payroll taxes. So that would be the federal payroll tax, Medicare, Social Security cannot be included in that. You also cannot include any compensation of an employee who's not a United States resident but working for you. And then lastly, you can't, as I mentioned before, you cannot include any of that emergency sick leave or emergency family leave that would get credit for under FFRCA. There you go.
Thank you, Tom. I do want to pose this question to the attendees on the call as well. But we had a question come in. It says, our PPP loan was approved and we signed the loan paperwork. How long does it take to get the money? So if you have already been approved for the loan and have received the money for that and would like to share in the chat with all attendees and panelists, we encourage you to do so there. And then I also want to give that question over to the gentleman here.
Yeah, I believe that once the bank has given you notice that they've approved the loan, I think they have either 10 days or less to put that into your account. So I know there is a small time limit that they have. So if it's beyond 10 days, then you need to be talking to your bank, because I believe there is a requirement that they have that in a certain amount of time. And I think it's pretty short.
We've had this question a couple times, and George, I know we've talked about this a little bit, but it says we received an email from the bank saying when you apply, you certify, this is for the PPP loan, that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support ongoing operations. And that was a language that the SBA put in, everyone has to sign off on. It says they go on to threaten, this is the bank, they go on to threaten fines and jail time if it's not true. And while we as a school certainly have current economic uncertainty due to enrollment projections getting smashed by 100 students, we do have an endowment we could use to help cover some of these losses. Should we still take this loan? And if we have reserves that can cover current real-time losses? And so this is for the whole panel here, but this is sort of one of those philosophical questions we've talked about before. And any thoughts there on how schools should be looking at that?
Well, again, I think, Philip, we've talked about this in the past, and I know it is one of those questions that you really, as a school, have to determine. But I think you also have to think about, the certification says, of economic uncertainties, and that doesn't necessarily, caused by the COVID virus, but that doesn't mean that it could not happen in enrollment time. Your enrollment could drop by 100 students. You may have to have other issues that could cause your school to possibly even close just because of that. And every school is going to be different. You're going to have to look at that and make some determination as to. But I think if you've got, and then like I said, if you've got an endowment or something where you have lots of money that most schools don't have, then again, that's something you need to really pray about and consider, and your board consider. We can't tell you yes or no, but it's going to have to be an individual choice in that.
And if I may, not to split hairs either, but economic uncertainty is, and if you've lost 100 students in enrollment, but you have funds set aside and you use that up, well, what if you lose your next 100? And I know I'm exaggerating a little bit. So again, I think follow Tom's recommendation there and determine what the Lord would have you to do and think seriously about that. But to me, who's never run a school, uncertainty is uncertainty.
Yeah, not to beat a dead horse, but I think any business in the country at this point could say economic uncertainty is a real thing, and so we are applying for it based on that. Now, you do have the larger corporations who are taking heat for, taking the limit of 10 million, and what are they doing with it? But in my mind, it's something. Are we doing this out of fear or out of faith as well? What's the basis of our decision? And so some of those type of aspects.
Yeah, and
let me mention, I think, Philip, too, when we think about the whole uncertainty, we've talked about that, and the question, though, too, is, is there, what's the time frame? Some of the new guys, and I know there's been some articles in the Wall Street Journal and Washington Times and others that have this fear factor. You better be sure you've taken it for the right reasons, or you're going to get all these penalties. But then when you read the guidance is really focused on a lot of those public companies that had some exemptions where some took as much as 20 million when they had lots of money sitting over there, or they had equity that they could use because of the stock market and those type of things. So again, I think that was some of the focus was more on those public entities that did take it. George?
Yeah, I was going to add to the fear factor. It's just, we also don't know what's going to happen in the future and how the federal government is going to address these kinds of things. And one thing that I've always been kind of disappointed with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, hurricanes, is that they have horrible process of clawing back money that they've given out. So, you know, that you've applied and they say, sure, you qualify, and they give you the money. And then 5 years later, they're like, oh, well, we're going to claw this back. So SBA doesn't have anything like that right now. And I expect that kind of a thing to happen. But, you know, you've just got to evaluate your risk and where you think it'll come down on that.
Couple questions on does this apply to summer camps, athletic camps, those type of things? And I'm going to say not, it does, but not as it specifically applies to a school program. But it is going to apply to those type of programs the same as it would before. And I would say, you know, from the standpoint of how many people are allowed to meet, where are they meeting, social distancing, all those type of things. The thing that does not change is going to be your potential for liability, whether it be you're doing it through your normal school day or you're doing it through these summer camps. Your liability is going to be the same, and so you want to make sure, again, that you, if something were to come up, someone were to get sick and they can trace it back to you, or heaven forbid someone passes, that you can have a defensible position, that we weren't asleep at the wheel, just kind of out there. You know, the other thing that is of concern is not just legal, but it's reputational. I think we've all seen in the news sort of the at odds between the government and some local churches, that we're going to continue doing services, and then local government saying no, you're not, and then how that plays into it with public media and public opinion as well. The same can be applied to your school if you come back and don't have a good plan in place. So some of those things don't go away regardless if it's school or summer camp.
Well, we're about out of time, Philip. I'll let you scroll for maybe one last question here. I do want to make everyone aware that this is concluding our weekly updates. However, our legal legislative team is not resting during this time. They'll be paying attention, and if there are changes to legislation soon in the future, we'll jump back on with one of these. So I want to make you aware of that. Continue to look at the legal coronavirus resources page. We're going to continue to update that, as well as emailing our team here at ACSI with your questions. Thank you to all of those that have participated in the chat and shared of their experiences. And Philip, do we have one last question to kind of round out our time together?
Yeah, there's one last question that talks about, do we have to put up the required non-discrimination posters when we take a PPP loan? The SBA guidance seems to be unclear on that when it comes to the faith-based aspect. I'm going to say the answer is probably yes. I'm not aware of the specifics that they're referring to, but you can always also put up what the religious liberties are that you have, right? So you don't get to choose what laws and what language get to be posted, but you can add additional, you know, we are a religious entity and we are exempt from this, or we are following this standard, or what have you. And I'll be honest, the reality of it is none of your employees are going to read this anyways.
But also post the SBA frequently asked question page and highlight that one, you know.
There you go. That's a great one. Yep.
Highlight the paragraph and put that next to it.
Yep.
Sarah, I want to just, from our legal legislative team, say thank you for all those that have participated the last several weeks. This has been a pleasure for us. We have just thoroughly enjoyed being able to help our schools, and that's really, you know, our legal team and our department is really a benefit to our schools. And you can call us anytime, you can email us anytime, and know that we're going to be there. We're going to try to answer your questions. We're not lawyers, but we'll get you, find the answer, what the law says. And if you need to, we'll refer you to a lawyer, but we're there for our schools. And I just want to remind our schools of that, and feel free to always call, always ask. And Sarah, thank you for these last several weeks, just of being a great host. And hopefully you've learned a few things about our department, and now you're a legal expert also. So
absolutely, I expect my little tag at the end of my name or something. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and so love spending time with our schools. And again, just want to reiterate, this isn't us taking a break. This is us being purposeful with your time. We recognize, you taking an hour out of your week every week to connect with us. Your time is precious. And so we want to make sure that when we spend this time together that we have the latest updates to provide. And so once again, if the need arises, we'll be back on here with these updates. And so encourage you to just continue to stay connected with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, that's the end of our time, and we look forward to staying connected.